I'm going to be talking today about breaking bias, which is about unconscious bias. For those of you who are huge Breaking Bad fans, I'm sorry, this is all the references I'm going to be putting to Breaking Bad. I really apologize for that. I've never actually seen the show. So a little bit about me. Here we go. I author for Pluralsight. I organize a couple of conferences. Maybe you've heard of them. NGConf, NG Cruise. Come cruise with us. Love to see you coming to the US and having fun with us. So, I'd like to start off by talking about a memory, right? Now, those of you who are out there listening to this, I'm sure you can identify with this feeling. You probably have some memories of something that you've done that was a little embarrassing. And when you think back to those times in that memory, you feel the embarrassment all over again, right? Like, you can still feel that like crunch in your gut of how could I have done that? For me, one of those most poignant times was when I was 16. I'm 16, I'm working my very first job, I'm working at a movie theater, okay? And at a movie theater, we had like 5 different managers. And a lot of them were kind of jerks, but there was this one manager who was super awesome. His name was Mr. Morris. And Mr. Morris happened to be African American, but he was just completely awesome. You could tell he really cared about the kids that were working at the theater. And to give you some background, I grew up in a house where my parents were quite a bit older than me, and they grew up in a much different world than I grew up in, and the world that I grew up in is much different than it is right now. So around my house, there was a lot of things that were said and jokes that were told that wouldn't necessarily be so acceptable today. So I'm in my job, I'm sitting there at this little place where we take the tickets for people that are going in, and one of the other employees is standing next to me, and he turns to me and he says, "Hey, will you go and clean out the popcorn maker?" And I responded to him with this habitual response that I had, and that was, "I ain't your," and the next word that came out of my mouth started with the letter N. I'm standing right next to Mr. Morris, this guy I really like, who's African American, right? And I said this right in front of him. And oh my gosh, the feeling that I had at that moment, I just, it's like the world came crashing down, time stopped. And I didn't even know what to do. I turned and I started apologizing, my foot almost literally in my mouth. I felt so terrible. And every time I think back to that experience, I can still feel that gut, in my gut, that uncomfortable feeling of how could I have done that, right? This is the kind of thing that I want to talk about today is where does that come from and how does this affect our behavior? So, first off, you may be wondering, why is Joe Eames talking about this? For one thing, if you all look at me, you can see that I am white, I'm male, I am cisgendered, I'm straight, I'm Christian, I'm upper middle class, right? If anybody's going to be talking about something like biases, does this seem like the right kind of person? And I want to tell you that I do believe that I am the right kind of person because if anybody has biases, it's going to be me. Right? I could not be more in the majority. I am so much in the majority, I'm almost like a unicorn, right? Like, I have no minority statuses whatsoever. So, I think I'm uniquely qualified to talk about biases. This scripture right here, I prefer the King James Version, this is why I got the King James Version up. This is really relating to what we're going to talk about today. It says, "Thou hypocrite, cast out the beam out of thine own eye." What they're talking about is a very large piece of wood. Then you can see to cast the mote out of your brother's eye. And the relation there, or the allegory there, is that you see something in somebody else and you want to fix it. The reality is that you have a problem that is much bigger in scope. And this is very important. I'm going to be talking about this because it's seeing in ourselves our own biases and understanding our own biases. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about the brain. I'm going to talk a whole bunch of science. I'm going to just overload you with science about the brain in this talk. For example, did you know that your brain consumes 20% of the energy that you consume as a whole, your whole body consumes? 20% is consumed by your brain, yet it only accounts for a few percent of your actual weight, like 3 or 4% of your weight. Yet it consumes 20% of your energy. There is so much going on in your brain. Take, for example, this picture up here. We can all look at this picture and agree that these two tables that we see are exactly the same size, yes? They are the same width and the same length. Nod your head if you agree with me, that those two are exactly the same. I'm not seeing any head nodding. Why is that? Well, this is an optical illusion, okay? This is a bug in our brain. I'm going to show you a little video that I recorded that you're going to find very interesting. Okay? This is that same piece of paper you saw the table, those two tables, how different they looked, and there's a little piece of paper I cut out, and I'm getting that exactly on. All right, so there it is. Now let's see it on the other table. What just happened? Did you guys see that? Let's go back to the original picture. These two tables, if we take the piece of paper and we cut those out, those two parallelograms are exactly the same size. Exactly the same size. But does your brain see that? This is a bug in the human brain. Our brain was built to process in a 3D world, yet these are 2D images that represent 3D objects. As our brain interprets these images, it interprets this table on the right as being fatter and shorter, and interprets the table on the left as being longer and thinner. Okay? Our eyes are seeing correctly. Our eyes see two parallelograms that are exactly the same size, but once it gets to our brain processes these differently. This is a bug in our brain. And this type of bug is what causes biases. All right. Who here's heard of the monkey sphere? Anybody heard of the monkey? Nobody's heard of the monkey sphere? We have one person who's heard of the monkey sphere. Okay, this is also called Dunbar's number. Dunbar was some kind of an anthropologist or maybe zoologist. Anyway, he figured out something very interesting about primates. If you take the size of a primate's brain as a ratio to the size of its body, there is this ratio number, and you apply it to a constant, and you come up with a number, and that number is Dunbar's number. And what this number is this number is the average group size that those primates, those monkeys, live in. Right? You could do this with chimpanzees, you can do it with gibbons monkeys, you could do it with bonobos. It's all the same. This works for every primate. It comes up with the average size of the groups that they live in. Right? The groups get too big for these monkeys, and then the groups break up. They're too small, they don't do well, they will end up combining with other groups. This is the average size group. So he discovered this about primates, okay? That same thing, we are primates, in case anybody who didn't know, we are primates. That same principle applies to us. You can apply Dunbar's number to humans, and you come up with a number. That number is 150. Our monkey sphere number is 150, and a lot of people have written some interesting stuff about this. One of the things that they've said is that 150 is about the number of people that we can really care about, right? That if they were to die, we would feel sad, that we can have a lot of connection with and really stay close to. It's about 150. They only discovered this number in the 70s, but humans have understood the principle of the monkey sphere for quite a while. For example, military units are very often based around this number of 150, and they have been since Roman times. Church congregations tend to size themselves about 150, right? This is a built-in number. Yet, what is the size of the communities that we live in as humans? Millions. We live in communities of millions, and yet our world is so connected. We really live in a community of billions, right? But our monkey sphere number is 150. This number, this aspect of being a primate, produces behavior that's groupish. What are the benefits of groups? Monkeys, right, all primates, they live in these groups. As evolution goes along, you have groups of these primates, right? As these groups compete with other groups for resources, for land, whatever, they compete against their own species and other species. The more cohesive the group, the more effectively that group works, the more capable the species is of surviving, propagating, and continuing on. Our ancestors went through this same process, right? Those groups had to be cohesive. And in order for a group to be cohesive, it needed to bond together. You needed to care about the other members of the group and feel a relationship to them, right? This turned into group behavior, which was very important. And we can't just ignore this group behavior. So what's funny is there's a lot of arbitrariness to our group behavior as human beings. But group behavior is important because it has a couple of key advantages. One I talked about was survival of the species, right? As these groups competed, they needed to compete effectively and be more cohesive as a group. All things being equal, the more cohesive group does better. But it also improves performance, right? And we benefit from that today. We see this in sports teams. Take a sports team and have it play against sports teams that are no competition for, and it plays relatively poorly. Put it against tight competition, performance goes up. We see this in business. Companies who compete in a monopoly, who exist in a monopoly and have no competition, have high overhead, high costs, low cohesion. They don't retain talent very well, right? They have nobody to compete against, and they do very poorly overall, right, when compared to internal metrics. Put that same company in an area with tight competition, and all of a sudden things change radically. Innovation goes up. Costs go down. Other pieces of overhead goes down. Cohesion goes up. Company retention, employee retention goes up, right? We perform better when we are in a group that we identify with and have another group to compete with. This is a biological fact. This is how our genetics are wired. But there are drawbacks to group behavior. Has anybody read the book The Sneetches by Dr. Seuss? Yeah? I got one? All right. I'll give you a little recap of this story, The Sneetches, okay? The Sneetches are these groups of creatures. And you can see over here, this Sneetch has a star on his belly, and this Sneetch does not. So in the Sneetches society, a small minority of the Sneetches had stars on their belly. They considered themselves to be above the other Sneetches. So they were throwing all the big parties, and the other Sneetches just stood around outside feeling ostracized and an outcast. Very sad, you can see in the picture. So this guy comes to the Sneetches and he offers the Sneetches without stars on their belly this amazing invention he'd created where for a small fee, he would put a star on their belly. So they start paying this man all this money and put stars on their belly, and pretty soon, most of the Sneetches have stars on their belly, and the old star belly Sneetches are starting to feel like their status has been taken away from them, and they're really upset about it. So the guy offers to them for, again, a fee, this machine that will take the star off their bellies. And now they go and take their stars off their bellies so that they can be exclusive again. And of course, then other Sneetches follow suit, and pretty soon they're putting stars on their bellies and off their bellies back and forth. And the person who ends up winning out was the guy with the machine because he made all this money. Human beings are very much like that. We will draw the most arbitrary of lines to create groups. There was a very interesting study where they took these college students and assigned them into two arbitrary groups. They told them that they were either overestimators or underestimators, okay? The fact was, they actually, even though they gave them a test, they didn't actually assign them to those groups based on their actual results. They randomly assigned those two groups out. Then they never once allowed them to know who else was in their group. So they had no connection with the other members of their group in the class. But they gave them opportunities to assign more resources, to give out more resources to members of their group. Not themselves, but other members of their group. They had resources that they could either give to members of their group or to everybody. And they found that people would prefer their own group that they identified with, even though it was completely random. They really weren't either an overestimator or an underestimator. And two, they had no idea who was in their group. They had no connection. Yet somehow they were still willing to give more resources and help assign out more resources to the people with whom they identified with. This is wired into us, into our DNA, this group behavior. And we will pay even a heavy price, personal price, in order to prefer our own groups. I was talking a little bit before about how powerful the brain is. Let's talk a little bit more about how powerful it is. Okay, as evolution goes along, you've got this brain that is running things, right? And with animals, they have no conscious thought. They just have an unconscious brain, okay? When it comes time to survive, we need a brain that is fast. If you see, has anybody seen the videos where the cats are, like, they put something that looks a little bit like a snake and the cats notice it and jump? You seen those videos? This is hardwired into just about every species. If in your own brain, if you see a shape that looks a little bit like a snake, you will do a double take and potentially even react, right? It's wired into our brains. Our subconscious will process that there's something that could potentially be like a snake a lot quicker than our conscious brain could process that same thing. This is very important, right? This is survival of the species. And our brain is wired to prefer safety, right? It errs on the side of safety. So it will identify far more things as snakes than actually are snakes. And there's good reason for that. False positives of identifying snakes, the only drawback is you might look a little embarrassed. But false negatives, right? If you see something that is a snake, but you think does not look like a snake, so you think it's not and your brain doesn't react, the cost could be death, right? So it's far more important that our brain works quickly, and it's more effective for it to over-identify. So our brain, for action equals survival, our brain was built for speed because speed is safety. All right? So our subconscious brain is processing things all the time, and it works on the principle of speed. It doesn't care how much it has to simplify the algorithm if it can make the algorithm faster. And like identifying snakes, if you see a stick that's in the shape of a snake, your brain will identify it as a snake, and you will react before you can consciously look and decide, is that a snake, is it not a snake? That is how our brains are wired. So these actions are really judgments, and our brain was built to judge easily. That has kept us alive as a species, and it keeps other animals alive as a species too. We have that same, it's often called the lizard brain. We have that same brain. So the problem is that we make judgments based on usually incomplete information and sometimes irrelevant information. For example, there was a really interesting study where they gave people these pictures of two individuals and asked them to rate who was more competent. Right? Now, think about this. How can you look at a picture and decide if somebody is more or less competent than somebody else? You really can't. Yet they found that people were willing to do that. In fact, nobody was willing to say, I don't have enough information. All the test subjects were able to rate one person as being more competent than the other. What they didn't know was they were seeing pictures of political candidates that were in a race, and the accuracy of the people, of the study subjects, how they picked the more competent person matched the winner of the political race about 60-70% of the time. So you could predict most political races by simply picking the subject that looks most competent to most people. What was another interesting thing about this particular study was that if they flashed these images only for a tenth of a second, quicker than the human eye can focus and your conscious mind can process the image, the test subjects were still able to pick out the more competent individual from a visual basis with the same accuracy, right? Not the actually more competent individual, but the one that the brain processes being more competent. Because it was the subconscious brain that's actually choosing which person looks more competent. And this is really important. This is how our brain works. We think that we are making all kinds of decisions day by day. Do I want to ride my bike to work? Do I want dessert with my food? Do I want the burger or the steak? Do I want the ratatouille? We think that these are all purely conscious decisions. Who am I going to hang out with today? Who do I want to hang out with? When in reality, our subconscious brain is making a lot of these decisions and guiding us and pointing us down the path. Most people think that their conscious thoughts represent the vast majority of what's going on that determines their behavior. But the reality is most cognitive scientists believe that the brain is much like an iceberg, right? Most cognitive scientists agree that the amount of our behavior that's determined by conscious thought is somewhere between 1 and 10% of our behavior. That most of our behavior is determined by unconscious thought, everything below the surface that we do not realize. Our preferences, our likes, actions, reactions is all determined mostly by our subconscious behavior, and our conscious behavior has a small effect on that. And that is why there is this analogy of the elephant and the rider, where the elephant is the subconscious brain and the rider is the conscious brain. And this is a very specifically chosen, this is a Jonathan Haidt that made this analogy. And he chose it very specifically because, for one thing, an elephant is a very smart creature, much smarter than a horse, but it's also a very large and powerful creature. And you can imagine a rider up on there trying to get the elephant to go one way or the other has very little effect so long as the elephant really wants to go in a certain direction, right? Now, this elephant happens to have 2 riders. That's what happens when you get married, but that's an entirely different talk. So this is a very good analogy and one that we should keep in mind, right? Those pictures that those people were seeing, the elephant was leaning one way or another. In fact, what's really interesting is that when making moral judgments, for example, scientists have discovered that most people will make a moral judgment based on their gut feeling, and the conscious brain is not, when they ask them to justify why they made that decision, they've determined that the conscious brain is actually making things up as it goes just to justify why you chose something. They did all these studies where they asked people to judge, is it immoral for somebody to say, they were asking Americans, take your American flag and cut it up into rags and use it to clean your house. And they would say, yes, it was immoral, and then they would ask for, why was it immoral, right? Why was it wrong? And the people were always making these gut decisions, and then their brain, their conscious thought was just justifying why they had made those decisions. The rider is most often a servant to the elephant. Most often, our rider is a servant to the elephant, okay? But the servant has actually a very important role, right? Our conscious brains can look into the future. Our subconscious brains cannot. Our animal brains cannot do this. Our conscious brains can look and see factors of safety and risk that our subconscious brain cannot. So the rider is very important. When the elephant says, I want to go in this direction, the rider can say, this is the safest path, right? So the rider could do things the elephant cannot. But the correlation, the sharing of power is not equal. And this makes sense. As the species developed, right, like all animals, we started off with only subconscious thought. We only had an animal brain. The conscious portion of our brain is a relatively new development evolutionarily speaking. The main part of our brain was not willing to say, oh, we got a new part of the brain. I'm just going to hand over control. Go ahead, start making all the decisions. No. It most of the time retains decisions, and that keeps us breathing. It keeps our heart beating, right? Our brain has to do all of that. It keeps us safe when we see what might be a snake. And it also determines our biases. Biases happen because of the way that our subconscious brain works. And scientists had a really difficult time, behavioral scientists had a really difficult time finding biases because of the way that people color what they say. So when they asked them for their attitudes and behaviors about different biases, whether it was women in the workplace or things like that, people, the words that they would, as they would ask them questions and they would respond, right? Oh, I do this and I don't think this and I believe this. They found out that their behavior didn't match up with those things. It was almost like the people were lying, right? They'd say, no, I totally agree with women in the workplace, yet maybe that person wanted their wife to stay at home and not work. And they'd find all these behaviors that didn't line up with what people were saying. And they discovered that it was because the conscious brain is not fully aware of everything that is going on. And this implicit association test was a way that they finally found out that they could find out these associations that we have that exist below our consciousness. So I've got my volunteer here, Yuri. He's going to help me out today. I'm going to show you guys an implicit association test, and Yuri's going to take it for us. Give him a hand. All right. I got to move this over onto. All right. This is an implicit association. So you're going to come over here and you're going to use my machine. All right? And here's how this works. So this is going to be sucky for you because let me change my display. Is that switched to the mirrored view? Oh, okay. Awesome. Thank you. I didn't know that shortcut. Okay, so what you're going to do is it's going to flash up in front of you words. So imagine I gave you a task where I said, take a deck of cards, and I want you to sort it. So don't look at this yet. I'm just going to ask you this question. Imagine I give you a deck of cards, and I want you to sort it, right? And I want you to put hearts and diamonds in one pile, and clubs and spades in another pile. Would that be fairly easy? You could go through that fairly quickly? Hearts and diamonds are both red, and spades and clubs are both. All right. Anyway, the red one's over here and the black one's over here. That's easy, right? You got this rule of okay, red goes over here, black goes over here. So all you're doing is looking at colors. You don't have to process the suits. But what if I asked you to put diamonds and clubs in one pile and spades and hearts in another? Would that be harder than doing it the other way? Yes, because you don't have that rule anymore. You got to look and process each. This is an implicit association, right? So this test is going to check for an implicit association due to flowers and insects, right? And they're going to be associated with either pleasant or unpleasant words. So this is going to show if you have an association that associates flowers with good words or with bad words over insects with good words and bad words, and it'll basically show, do you feel more positively about flowers or about insects, right? So the results should not be surprising. And what we're going to do is you're going to hit space bar, and it's going to flash up a word, and if it's a flower or an unpleasant word, you should press the E key. So put your fingers on E and then I. If it's an insect or a pleasant word, you should hit the I key, all right? And then you hit the space bar to start, and it'll go through about 30 words. I might stop you early. Okay, go ahead and go. And everybody else, imagine this, right? You want to hit it with the left side if it's a flower or pleasant word. Oh, you got it wrong, okay? You want to hit the right side, which happens to be the E key, if it's an insect or an unpleasant word. Getting it wrong. You want to go fast, but be accurate. Try not to make any mistakes. You're doing terrible. Keep going. You're doing fine. Okay, remember, insects and pleasant words is your I key. Unpleasant words and flowers is your E key. Having a hard time with this. All right, stop. Okay, now we're going to go to this other tab here. We're going to do the same thing, except now it's insects or unpleasant words are your E key. Flowers or pleasant words are your I key. All right? And the same thing, you hit spacebar to start. This will be your two keys. Insects are unpleasant is E. Flowers are pleasant I. We're going to watch him go here. And again, everybody can kind of imagine they're doing this themselves. All right, go ahead and stop. What did you find? Which one was easier for you? This is much easier. Okay. You're processing this subconsciously. You're seeing this correlation. If the issue was, hey, understand, does the word exist in one of these two groups? That's your conscious mind that categorizes them. And so if it was purely a conscious activity, this would take the same amount of time for you, whether or not they were insects and unpleasant words on one side or the other. You're just categorizing, putting things into two different groups, right? But because you have an implicit bias that says, I like flowers, so they're easier to associate with pleasant words, and insects are easier to associate with negative words, it goes a lot faster. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Give him a round of applause. This is an implicit association test. I'm going to go back to my slides here, and it was Alt F1. Is that what it, Yuri? Alt F1? Yeah. And I got that. Now we're back. Okay. So this is an implicit association test. Now, we did this for flowers and insects. Would you be willing to come back up and we'll do the same thing, except it'll be white people and black people and associate with positive or negative words. You want to do that in front of everybody? Does anybody want to? Okay, now I'm not going to ask anybody to do this, right? The results could be embarrassing, right? I want you to imagine for a moment, you probably came into this session thinking that I don't have a negative association with people of another race, or I don't have a negative association, I don't have a bias against women working in tech. If you Google implicit association test or project implicit, you can find that Harvard website we were looking at has a bunch of tests. Some of them are women and associated with tech, elderly people, race. There's a whole bunch of these tests, and you could take these tests. And I highly recommend that you go and do that because, one, you will discover things that you did not know about yourself, right? You probably walked into here assuming you did not have certain biases, but the reality is that you do, and we're going to talk about why. Where do biases come from? This is a picture of my exchange student's daughter. Her name's Pina. She's German. Biases come from us being babies, all right? Now, she's not actively going around and developing her own biases and deciding to be racist and think that women shouldn't be in tech, okay? What's happening is, as we are babies, we have yet to develop conscious thought. Our brain is processing this wide world around us, and it continues to process this world around us even as we grow up and gain that conscious thought. Our subconscious brain is processing everything. And remember, survival is, we need fast rules, okay? It has been proven that babies recognize their mother's voice when they're born because they have heard it. Within about 5 hours of exposure, a baby can now recognize its primary caretaker, usually mother, its primary caretaker's face. If its primary caretaker is a female, the baby will prefer female faces to male faces. If the primary caretaker is Caucasian, the baby will prefer Caucasian faces to non-Caucasian faces. Okay? This is hardwired in. Why would this be? Anybody ever heard of how ducklings imprint? Anybody ever heard of this? You can take ducklings, and when they're born, if you take the mother away as they hatch and give them some other moving object, they will imprint on that moving object, and they will follow it around wherever. There's been all these studies where these scientists will put on big yellow galoshes, right? Take the mother duck away, and when the babies are born, they just walk around, and the ducks imprint on the galoshes, and we'll follow the galoshes. You could take the galoshes off, somebody else puts them on, and they just follow those galoshes around. They don't care about they just see this moving object, and they imprint. Humans and primates and most animals have a similar process. With humans, it's more complex. It's not purely an imprinting process, but it has the same functionality, and that is, when you are born, is the things around you are likely to be what is safe for you. So you learn to prefer those things that are around you when you are born. And as you get more and more exposure, you continue to prefer those things, right? So if you are a duck, you will prefer the other ducks that you're around because that's what you're born, so that when you see a dog, you will fly away, right? You don't prefer the dog. That's survival of the species. Right? This is hardwired. We are animals. We are primates. This is hardwired into us too. We prefer these things. So babies have these biases. They are biased towards things that are familiar to them. They did these tests where they had a person of the same race as the primary caregiver and a person of a different race offer the exact same toy to a baby, and the baby invariably will accept it from the person of the same race. Okay? These biases are built into us. Well, they don't just start and end with our immediate family. These biases that we generate, our subconscious processing, continues on beyond that. So our subconscious brain is continually processing the world that we see around us. And what do we see on media? We see white people, and oftentimes men, as the heroes in stories. We see that everywhere. We see some exceptions to these rules, but mostly our media sees this. It has been proven by, again, scientific experiment that very, very frequently African-American young girls will prefer white dolls to black dolls. They find them prettier. This is a lot of this is because there is portions of our brain that are used when we think about people that we believe are in our group that we identify with, and different portions of our brain that are used when we think about other people. This is wired into us. This also leads to what's known as systematic oppression in this, a very specific example of this. There was a story about a Harvard professor who cut her hand. She went into the hospital. She was quilting. Her boyfriend said to the doctor, she quilts, and we want to make sure that the damage, doesn't affect her ability to quilt. And the doctor says, no problem. We just need to quickly stitch her up and things will be okay. Then one of the interns recognized this woman as a professor, and they're at the Harvard, it was actually Yale. They're at the Yale hospital. So this doctor is part of the Yale staff. The internist sees that this woman is one of her professors, says, Professor, what happened? The minute the doctor realizes that she's a professor, he leaves the room, he gets on the phone with one of the best hand surgeons on the Eastern Coast. Within an hour, they have her in surgery with this highly qualified surgeon. Now, for him, what he has done is he has said, this person is like me. I want to give more to them, right? I feel this kinship. I want to do the extra mile. He's done something nice, right? But what he has also done is not done something for somebody with whom he does not identify, who is not in his group. Who is more capable of giving? The majority? Who has more to give, more extra resources to give? The majority or the minority? The majority, right? And who are they most likely to give those extra resources to? When we give money, who are you most likely to give money to? What kinds of foundations? The ones that we identify with. This is systematic oppression. I'll be honest. I didn't really believe much in systematic oppression until I had done research for this talk, right? I hadn't seen how much the majority continues to maintain the status quo because we are often giving beneficially to those with whom we identify with more. So, what does this all mean to us? Well, there's a difference between knowing and endorsing. There's these flat earthers, right? People that believe the earth is flat, okay? If we do an implicit association test on them, we would find that they associate the earth with being a sphere, right? Because they can't, and they will tell you, you can't live in this world and see all these globes and all these pictures that are on TV without beginning to, your subconscious soaking in the fact, this idea that the world is a sphere, yet they believe the world is flat. There is a difference between knowing and endorsing something. If you know that there's a stereotype that women perform worse at math, but you don't believe it, you don't endorse it, and that stereotype soaks down into your subconscious, it can affect your behavior without you believing and endorsing that idea. And this is the key point that we need to understand today. That regardless of what we believe, our subconscious is soaking up things that we may not agree with, and that does affect our behavior. It affects our behavior when we're babies, and it continues to affect our behaviors when we are adults. There are self-defeating biases. There is an implicit association test between women associated with women and men, work and home, right? If you give this test to men, 75% of men will show a very strong bias that men are associated with work, women are associated with the home. If you give 75%, if you give that same test to women, 80% of them will have a strong bias. These implicit associations on the Harvard website have been taken millions of times. These are their numbers. 80% of women have a bias against women having a job. The bias against women performing well in math is extremely high and strong amongst women. The bias against African Americans and people of color performing poorly in school exists very highly and very strongly among those groups. These are self-defeating biases. This is my daughter, Katya. She's 19. She's just enrolling in a tech school, right? She has this same bias. So, what do we do now? We've established that we have biases, that they're normal. So let's just debug our brains, right? Let's remove our biases. Well, as of yet, nobody has discovered a way to have any permanent effect on your biases. Nobody has discovered anything that we can do to reduce our biases on a permanent basis, these implicit biases. So there are ways to, There are ways to work around our biases. One of them is to use systems that eliminate biases effects. So an interesting thing that happened with symphonies, in the 70s, they only had about 10% of their performers were female. They introduced a screen when they auditioned performers, and the numbers went up to 40% because they couldn't see the person who was auditioning, right? Very simple solution to a system that completely removed the opportunity for bias to take effect. We should be conscious of our biases. The minute we're conscious of them, our rider that has less power than the elephant can begin to direct the elephant in new directions, but only if we are conscious of them. Not acting immediately, there's another thing that we can do. If we don't act immediately, then we give more time for the rider that's slower to make decisions that the elephant wants to make. Finally, or next is creating transparency and accountability. The more that we are accountable for decisions like hiring, promoting decisions, accountable to other people, and especially people who may exist in the groups against which we may have biases, the better we will do at not following our biases and defeating them in those decisions. And choosing positive role models. This is another good thing. If you look at good examples of people that are within the groups you have biases against, you will temporarily lower your biases' effects. What about self-defeating biases? Well, it's kind of the same thing. There's really just two methods. One is positive role models. They found that women who take math classes from women professors do better, while the men still do the same. So finding these positive role models that exhibit the behaviors that you have your own self-defeating biases against will help you lower the effect of your biases. And then there's lots of creative and simple ideas. One computer science department saw their enrollment skyrocket of women by simply decorating their computer science department in a more traditionally female manner. How do we raise low-bias children? Well, exposure is about the only thing that we can do, and even then, you must realize that social media and media at large is still going to mostly wire them against what you're trying to do. But the more exposure you can give them to other groups and other ideas, other faces, is going to have a positive effect. So I want to do, I think that we've talked a lot about science, right? And we have seen a lot about behavior. We've talked a lot about behavior. And hopefully you felt a little bit more educated about the power that your conscious mind has, right? But all this doesn't matter if it doesn't drive us to action. If you leave here and don't take any action, I might as well have been showing you cat videos for 45 minutes, okay? Instead, we need to do something about our biases. Now, I've painted kind of a grim picture, right? Showed how powerful they are, but we can do something, and it starts with being aware. I hope that everybody who has not before taken an implicit association test heads over, when you have time, to Project Implicit. You could just Google it and take some of these implicit association tests and see the biases that you have, these subconscious biases that affect your behavior that you don't know about. Take some time, because if you leave this room believing that you are not part of the problem, then I have failed. Now, I want to do one last experiment, and this is going to involve everybody, okay? So I'm going to show you phrases up here. If that phrase applies to you, I want you to stand up, okay? Now, if you see a phrase, if the next phrase doesn't apply to you, sit down. But so long as the phrase that's up there, or the most recent phrase, applies to you, I want you to stay standing, all right? And I want you to notice who else is standing. So everybody get ready. We're going to be doing some standing here, all right? So I'm going to show these phrases. When you see the phrase that applies to you, please stand up and stay standing. I have felt pain. I have experienced joy. I have felt excluded. I have cared deeply about somebody else. I have been hurt by someone I care about. I have hurt someone I care about. It is our unconscious mind that wants to identify the differences that we have with those who are not in our groups. Notice how people are standing up in this room, right? But it is our conscious mind that gives us the power not only to look and see our commonalities, but to understand our moral duty to fix what is wrong and to do better with what we have been given. Thank you very much.